I just have one word, finally. So in this video, I'm going to quickly go over the ban list, but also cover some of the impact and also approaches that you may want to consider with these decks that are affected. Also, I'll suggest different variants that the clan may have access to, so that's something for you to think about. And at the end of the video, I'll just have my closing thoughts and kind of talk about also some other things that should have been impacted, also give some other viable decks to consider, and then also just think about the future for premium format. So right off the bat, we see that Lure, the V series, has a choice restriction with the Crest Giver. So you can actually use different Lures if you want to. This is not a surprise. More Crest decks were affected. This is a welcome change. I'll talk more about Crest, about how they probably should have done this way sooner rather than now at the end of the video too. So stay tuned for that. As a whole, for Keter Sanctuary, Reverence Rush Dragon is restricted, so you cannot use it. The main problem with this card is that you stack grade 3 heals and be able to reduce your damage. This is prevalent for control-based decks that want to stall a little bit till they get to their win condition. A good example is Gize decks and Ephemeral decks that are more focused like the Melissa Loop, essentially, too. Onto more of the crests that were affected is Shiranui. With Shiranui, too, it's really interesting because Oboro had access to the History Collection Stride, which is fine. With Lure, it didn't even have access to it. It was actually with the Claret Sword. But Shiranui, now you have to actually think about, do you want to go History Collection with Oboro, or do you want to go with Crest and give that up? What's really odd is that you can use the V-Series one, or use Zanki as alternatives. That's the different approach you can take. Although, the only difference is that with V Oboro, you just get the Protect marker, and turn 3 is not the greatest. It's also heavily reliant on the original Shiranui tomb. So that's one approach that you can take, but I don't know if that's necessarily worth it. The other approach is that you can rely on Zanki and just have the crests that way, but you miss out on the History Collection Stride as well. Now, I want to skip a little ahead because Nubatama did get impacted even more so. They banned Mizukaze and Sukumoroken. These are heavy limiting guard restriction types of cards, or limiting this hand size to 4, giving Nubatama as a whole a way to close games, essentially. And then everybody has been wanting these cards to just be hit somehow. And here we are. This does hurt Shiranui in a way to close out games, especially where you basically have these two options that are great, and now you don't have these options anymore. You can make an argument that we have Ren still, but again, Ren is not that hard to play around with. And then you may consider a different variant of Nubatama, such as Hanzo, for example. But one of the highlights for Hanzo is that not only you have the multi-attack from the Hanzo copies, but you relied on Sukumoroken to be able to finish the game as well. So it's just kind of man, that got affected a little bit too. There are other options too, whether it's a Hanzo deck or a Shiranui deck. As long as you stride into a Shiranui, you still have access to the name. So you can have access to the restanders such as Sekai and then also Furai if you want to rely on that still. But Nubatama has some different options. It is not a dominant deck as much as I hoped it would be, but I'm sure people are glad that this has happened overall anyway. So interestingly enough, there's Messiah with the choice restriction too. I think this is fine. There's the Deleter Messiah build too that does really a lot without the crest anyway to begin with. So that build is something that you guys can look towards too. It's really solid. In fact, with the Negro Lily restriction, if people are not playing Negro Lily anymore to have the Cannoneer play, that can also have that deck really go off on its turn 4 and just outright win. Harry and Chrono Jet. So with Jet decks, definitely will be missed. Time Leap is really a proponent of this too, so it's man, this kind of sucks for that. I'm not too familiar with the Gear Chronicle deck for different options too. There's also Steam Maidens as an option too, but I don't know how prevalent that is. Maybe in the slower-ish type of meta, Steam Maidens might be a pick. And it did also get a choice restriction between the Crest Giver and Melum as well. Melum, the G Melum, is the proponent of Time Leap, essentially. And this lets you get TikTok so you can do more combos and really go off from that. And of course, take advantage of any force markers that you generated too along the way. I do want to slow down with Harry a little bit too, since I've picked up this deck and played it as well and top with it. This deck has a couple issues to address. So the Crest being one of those things where it gave it enough power so the multi-attacks can actually swing on their own and actually demand a lot of shield from your opponent. Harry before really got stopped by just a single trigger, kind of like the Aqua Force Prom. We do have more options now, so that's something I may explore and keep G Harry, so that way you have access to the History Collection Stride. The other route that you can take is use Betty and V Harry, so you have the stage essentially, so that's one option to go to. The one thing with V Harry though, it's typically a more fragile based deck compared to G Harry, mainly because you need specific pieces in the soul, especially if you're trying to do like a Denial Griffin play. And in order to do the gruesome play, you have to have like another piece involved in the mix too. For G Harry, it still has the Magia. With Magia, you can use Magia and be able to directly call from Saul when you G-guard. So that's something to consider. The other aspect of it is that you want to be able to do something on your turn 3. Harry, at least the way that I've been playing it with the crest, has not a phenomenal early game. So you really don't want to have like a grade 2 game whatsoever. You just want to get into your actual strides and start going nuts from there. So that's why I was thinking like G Harry going into your history collection stride to get 2 Excel circles is still fine, but you just had to mitigate as if you were basically missing the crest essentially. So that's one approach. The other variant to think about too in Pale Moon is Nightmare Dolls too. So that actually is still pretty much full power. So if you feel like that's a good pick right now, I think that might be something to relook at as well. Now into Stow Chaos. So we have Night Rose and then Sea Strike along it off. So with Night Rose, obviously the same thing with Crest. What's really interesting about Night Rose though is that we've already seen topping lists with V Night Rose with the Crest. And so that's something that the deck can easily adapt to. Losing Sea Strike it does hurt. It's annoying because this was an easier way to get cards like Beatrice to be able to revive Skull Dragons and Ghost Ships pretty easily. It was also a way to get your grade 3 heals and even like Bracing Angel Ladder, Forbidal, like cards like that. So now we had to heavily rely more onto Greed Shade to do the same thing. And Greed Shade's not a bad option. Thankfully, Grand Blue has that, but it does mill from the deck, so that's something to also consider. The other option is that you could play Starlight and use the crest that way, but I feel like just going to V Night Rose is probably the best way anyway. You miss out on Bandit Rum, but like Bandit Rum wasn't that great and it felt like not as necessary. So as long as you're able to get at least 1 protect marker from writing the V Night Rose and then going into like Obadiah or your other strides, I think it's just fine with typical Grand Blue stuff. And as kind of I mentioned and alluded to is that Negro Lily, there's a choice restriction with Beatrice. So you have to pick one or the other. This actually is tough because Beatrice is the main combo to get like Cannoneer, Grenache, Greed Shade, other combo pieces that you want from the Negro Lily interaction. But also like during your battle phase, you want to extend attacks. And especially if it's just a Soul Blast rather than a Counter Blast, Beatrice is there to help a lot of those plays too. So it's not just about this disruptive play. It's more to the deck essentially. And I feel like especially if you're not playing Crest anymore, then you have a more viable right target with Beatrice too. So you can actually keep writing Beatrice. That could become more of a focused Beatrice deck again, kind of. That's another route to take a sense. But I feel like you may want to pick Beatrice over Negro Lily just because it does a lot for the deck already. The other aspect that you could do is play without Beatrice and play with Negro Lily still, so you still have that retire play during your turn. And essentially what you could do with the Night Rose GB2 skill, assuming that you don't play Crass on top of that, anything retired from Rearguard Circle, you can use her GB2 skill to revive. Kind of like the old school G-Era days. That's how we used to do it. We actually would revive Cannoneer or Negro Lazy back in G-Era to be able to do that pseudo play where we could do the Denial Griffin. And that actually typically was a 3 counterblast play, but then thanks to Negro Lazy being able to refund that could be something explored. But is it worth it? Probably not, especially with everything going on. But again, having a disruptive play is also really impactful in certain matchups too. So it's really hard to judge is what I'm getting at. And also with Sea Strike, this actually impacts all of the chaos. So this impacts like Aqua Force, Neo Nectar, Mega Colony, Great Nature, so on. So those decks would definitely miss this as a utility tool. I think this card really helped those decks in its own way too, but it's definitely more prevalent in Grand Blue for sure. Now into the more clan-specific ones. So this is specifically to Genesis. I'm somewhat surprised with this because they actually touched Dreaming Dragon. People can argue like, well, Genesis will never deck out because of Dreaming Dragon. That's true. I feel like as I play Genesis in general, Dreaming Dragon doesn't always have to come up too. There are other ways to mitigate that too, but like just having this to 0 was kind of surprising. I wouldn't mind it if they made it to 1 or 2 copies, but it is what it is. But the next 2 hits obviously were meant for Fenrir. You got Gauja, you got Melissa. For me, this is fine. I think just avoiding the whole Melissa loop, this is fine. You can focus on a G Fenrir. That's more of an aggro type build too. If you want to go that route, I know the new grade 2 Keter unit came out related to like having the amount of crits and also guard restriction. So that's something that people have been talking about recently. So I thought I'd throw it out there. The alternative though, as a variant, is Regalia. You also have Valkyrian, but then Valkyrian is also impacted by Dreaming Dragon, so I have no idea. But for Regalia, for sure, Regalia is untouched. Not only that, but we got the grade 1 promo, Azucena, that actually helps us not deck out too. So don't forget about we got that card too. So I feel like having their card makes this a little bit easier to adjust. So we're not necessarily decking out too quickly. Real quickly with the NOK hit, this is Hope on Damp and Variance Harleg. Hope on Damp for sure. I've seen this like in this season too, just losing to it. I know like this card is so hard to guard against. Having the exact is just like, yeah, let's get rid of this. It's kind of like the Mizukaze thing. So I understand the sentiment. NOK can go off so if it has everything that it needs. It's not a bad deck. It's also very combo reliant. So as long as you have those combo pieces, it's fine, you know? Especially if you're going against a player that isn't necessarily how to play against it, especially if they're going second and the NOK player goes first and you give the NOK player a counterblast, they can pretty much win if they got everything going on too. Now to Mega Colony, so Gridora got hit again, but this time 2-1. So that means Mega Colony decks only have access to 1 Gridora. They still have access to Oportunandis or Lawless, a complicated name. They have access to Overwhelm, so they have different options to go about. I think it's just like really harder on this clan because Mega Colony is really carried by Gridora in terms of strides. And you had to focus your efforts on different directions depending on what you play. There's always like Gridora builds, like the grade 3 is this Mythiarch build that's been recently topping. There's also like maybe Machinings. There's also different Giraffe, like the Ride Chain. Different directions you could take about this, but just still having the 1 is better than 0. I guess that's one way to look at it. And in a way against other meta decks such as like Granblue and Harry, now they get a chance to still play. The only difference is that they just have to deal with 1 Gridora. You got also Katrina hit to 1 for Neonectar. This is actually really impactful. So me diving into Musketeers over 2 years ago, I realized that Neonectar has a lot of just strides that are utility based. They don't really have an aggressive stride compared to Katrina. And now that Katrina was back, and now it showed a lot of prevalence in the metagame as we saw, especially with the token builds. But now back to 1, it makes it in that spot where like, man, we just got 1 Katrina and we got to make it count essentially. So you can see this, maybe a Katrina could be the first stride that is not only trying to win that turn, but also maybe like a setup thing. It just depends. I know Musketeers can take advantage of this and then also fall back to Ladislava or different strides depending on what they attack in the main deck too. So it's not necessarily a huge problem for Musketeers. So that's a variant that I recommend checking out. I'm definitely going to revisit Musketeers again. For the token-based decks, I'm not so sure though, because Katrina is so important with the power-up and making like Force to so threatening too. So that's something very impactful. That's pretty much for the main stuff, and hope those suggestions help with the approaches, the different variants too. My closing thoughts that I really want to like slow down to as well. There are other viable decks too that were not affected by the ban list. Obvious ones were like DP, for example. They still have Linka, they still have Unibird, they still have like the crazy stuff that they have access to. There's Highlander also. I almost forgot about Highlander for a quick minute, but they're still around. Narukami too. It's already been hit on the ban list, but it's still a solid deck where it can stand. So that's something that I'm not surprised if we see it come back. There's also Victor. Victor is like scary when it goes off too, especially just not needing a crest and still get big enough to like demand more shield. And it starts off at turn 3 too, which is kind of crazy too. There's Chaos as well if you want to revisit Chaos in that respect too. Rising Nova, so there's like the more control-based builds such as like Hellheart 8, just like Harf 1 recently in one of the events too. That's also a fun build. There's more of the aggressive build too. There's Jewel Knights too for sure for Royals. Raging Form for Shadows, that was the one thing I forgot to mention about Luard. For Shadows, we have Raging Form, which is something that I'll be revisiting as well. One thing that I want to mention too is Gurgwit. They have access to Ultimate too, so you can, and no longer has to worry about like other decks just being faster and also just increasing power with the crest too. So I feel like Gurgwit can actually keep up in that sense. So that's something to consider. And I think lastly, the one that also comes to mind is Gize-based decks. So we see Angel Gize being Revel in the season, but I'm sure there's other Gize type decks that can take advantage of it too. The one thing that they hit a lot, which is I'm grateful for it. Of course, I'm sure other people would agree if they hit a little bit of other stuff like the decks that I just mentioned too. But like there's also the OTs. Like the OTs are still legal. Like that did not get touched whatsoever. And I'm just like, well, that would have been nice if they just finally got rid of that too. I think the other thing to think about is like the crest hits. Like if I go back to Shiranui, for example, like I wish this hit would have come sooner rather than later. Not only that it should have happened maybe like January of this year, for example, when they initially did the first 2025 hit, but I mean like 2 years ago where Jet and Messiah came out, why not just make it clear that, hey, if you're going to play Crest, you're not going to play the History Collection guy, grade 3, and then in case of lure, you're not going to spam force markers. I wish they would have done that. So in a way, it kind of feels like it feels kind of like a bit jaded. It's like, let me buy all this product, 4 deck sets to get my 4 crest givers. And then it's like, eventually it's going to be hit, but it doesn't get hit. And then all of a sudden, like finally we hit it. And it's just like, you could have done this like to begin with. Why wait 2 years? And then of course, with Harry and Night Rose. And then of course, Shiranui just like dominating for a while with the crest too, and just wait up to this point, right? My best educated guess is just business product sales. They wanted to sell as much product as they can, and so this, if they have an audience for it, why not make the sales? And again, the last crest decks that came out was in January, late January of 2025, and it's now almost April basically, and this will be effective May 1st as well. So it's like, why wait these months? And then so I think you already follow along. Although it is refreshing to revisit some decks too, especially with this new metagame. It's gonna definitely change. I feel like for the first couple of events, depending if there's cash pool events or maybe going into Worlds, and then eventually Summerfest beginning, we'll start seeing a lot of cool decks coming from it, but also things start to stabilize at one point. The reason I say that too is because Worlds will have Worlds level players, so those are the players that are going to play their decks that they're very confident in. That's not as reflective to the rest of the events for Summerfest, for example. So there's a lot of variance when it comes to Vanguard, and it's just evident when you play the Swiss rounds comparing to the top tables too. So I'm excited to see how that pans out. The last thing I want to say is that perhaps there's hope for premium format. Why go through this trouble of having this extensive ban list and feel like the format is no longer supported, right? There is an audience for it, obviously, especially on the English side. And I'm curious what they do with Worlds and moving forward, especially with Summerfest having like only certain locations having premium. We still don't know the rest of the year of product, at least for the English side. So there might be a chance that there could be a history collection 2 or something to kind of like revamp the premium format again to something much more better, more diverse, however they want to envision it for them. But it's not necessarily 100% guarantee. But I do want to at least kind of mention that thought that I just had too, that there might be some hope. I also want to give a special shout out to Sagran. Actually, these are my thoughts, and then also like I wanted to bounce off somebody from a different perspective. So his perspective was super helpful on catching some things that I missed as well. And then lastly, if you want to check out the rest of my videos, feel free to check these videos. Till next time, amigos. Bye.